I still remember the way the door clicked behind him. 40 years of marriage ended in a sound so small, it almost didn't exist. He didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't even turn around. He just said, "You'll be fine, Margaret," and walked out with a suitcase that I'd packed for him once, decades ago, when we still cared about the same things. The morning light came through the kitchen window, cutting across the table where we used to have breakfast. His coffee cup was still there, half full, like he might come back for it. He never did. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty chair. Part of me wanted to scream, but I didn't. I'd learned long ago that silence was safer, that it hurt less than begging. When I finally moved, it was to check the drawers. The savings account we'd built together was gone. He had taken every dollar, every last piece of trust. I found myself whispering, not in anger, but disbelief. How could someone you built your whole life with just erase you? And then as I reached for a tissue, I noticed the small wooden drawer under the counter, the one he never cared to open. Inside was an envelope with my father's handwriting, yellowed with time. The sight of it steadied me, because while Thomas had taken everything he could see, there were things he never even knew existed, and that was the day I stopped being the woman he left and started becoming the woman he'd regret losing. I woke up before the sun because the house didn't know how to sleep without him. Every room felt too wide, as if the walls had taken a step back to give the absence more space. I made tea I didn't drink and walked the halls like a guest, pausing at picture frames that suddenly looked like evidence. The bank app wouldn't open at first. My hands were shaking, and the password felt like a riddle I should have solved years ago. When it finally loaded, the numbers looked wrong. Not smaller, but erased. Checking, savings, emergency. All reduced to neat zeros that didn't argue and didn't explain. I sat at the edge of the bed and tried to remember the sound of his promise the day we opened our first account. He called it ours. I believed him. At the post office, the clerk avoided my eyes the way people do when they know something they shouldn't. A credit card bill waited for me, swollen with charges I hadn't made. Hotel, jewelry, a restaurant 2 towns over with linen tablecloths. Someone had been taken there and felt special. It wasn't me. By afternoon, I was back in the kitchen, sorting papers like a librarian of a life no one would read again. I opened drawers that had been loyal and quiet for 40 years. Receipts. Warranties for appliances that had already outlived their guarantees. A church bulletin with my handwriting in the margin. Remember to breathe. The bookshelf in the living room gave up its secrets one by one. Wedding album, tax returns. A cookbook with a flowery thumbprint on the lemon pie page. When I tugged an old gardening manual free, something thin slipped and landed face down at my feet. A single folio, thick with age, tied with a cotton ribbon. I pulled the ribbon loose and set the paper on the table. My father's name stared back at me in a steady, careful hand. The title at the top read like a truce I had forgotten to remember. Warranty deed. My name appeared next, not ours. Mine alone. The description of the property was clinical and exact. Acres and boundaries drawn like a quiet map of belonging. I traced the corner of the page with my fingertip until the sting in my eyes eased. Thomas had taken everything he could reach. He had not reached this. I folded the deed gently, returned it to its envelope, and slid it into the bottom drawer I had just emptied. When the phone rang, I let it. The house could listen. I had something else to do, find the key that would open the rest of my past. As I stood, the light shifted across the table, brightening the envelope like a sign. I whispered to the empty room, "You didn't know, did you, Thomas?" And that was the moment the house felt less empty. Not because he might come back, but because I finally knew where to start. I spent the next morning in the attic, where the air smelled like cedar and old winters. The stairs creaked under my weight, as if they were surprised to feel life again. Dust floated in the light like slow confessions, and for the first time in days, I didn't cry. was too curious. The boxes up there had followed me through decades of moves, sealed with tape that outlasted our marriage. I tore the first one open and found my life in layers. Report cards, love letters, birthday cards from people long gone. Beneath it all was a smaller box, wrapped in faded blue paper, tied with the same cotton ribbon my father always used for everything important. Inside were his letters. Each envelope had my name written in that same steady hand. The first one was dated the year I got married. He must have written it right before he died. To my Maggie, life will give you men who speak louder than their hearts. Don't mistake volume for love. The land is yours not just by law, but by right. It's where you come from. Don't let anyone take it, not even the man who claims to protect you. I read it twice before folding it back. My father had known Thomas before Thomas even knew himself. The second letter was shorter, almost unfinished. If you ever need to start again, start there. The land remembers who you are. I leaned against an old chest, holding the letters to my chest, as if they could still carry warmth. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of children playing down the road, the same sound that once filled this house. Now it only echoed. I opened the deed again, tracing the boundaries with my finger. It wasn't just land. It was a promise I had forgotten. My father had built fences with his hands, not words. And here I was, letting someone like Thomas take down everything he'd ever built for me, one withdrawal at a time. By the time I climbed back down, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Steadiness. Not happiness, not forgiveness, but a quiet sense of direction. I placed the letters on the kitchen table next to a blank notepad. I didn't know what I'd write yet, but I knew it would begin with a boundary. Before bed, I looked out the window toward the horizon, where my father's land still stretched beyond sight, untouched. Tomorrow, I decided I would drive there, and as I turned off the light, I whispered to the darkness, maybe it's time the land remembered me too. The next morning, the town looked exactly the same, but I didn't. The grocery store still had the same faded sign, the diner still smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, and the same people still talked about everyone else's business. But as I walked through those doors, their whispers felt different. They weren't just gossip anymore. They were small, sharp knives looking for a wound. I could feel their eyes on me. Poor Margaret, the woman whose husband left her for someone half her age. I'd seen that story before, on other faces, in other aisles. I just never thought it would be mine. I picked up a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and kept my head high. Grace spotted me before I could escape. She was standing by the magazines, her gray curls glowing under the fluorescent lights like a halo she'd earned. "Margaret," she said, her voice soft but knowing, "you've lost weight." I smiled because it was easier than telling her the truth, that I'd lost more than that. Grace didn't ask for details. She never did. Instead, she linked her arm through mine and said, "Come on, coffee's on me." At the diner, she talked and I listened, about her garden, her cat, her son who still hadn't called. Then she leaned closer and said, "You don't have to disappear just because he did. You've always been the steady one, Maggie. Maybe it's time to be loud." Loud. The word felt foreign in my mouth. I'd spent my life keeping things quiet, my doubts, my fears, my anger, but as I watched the sunlight hit the window, I realized how small silence can make you. That afternoon, I drove toward the edge of town. The road narrowed, lined with fences that had outlasted marriages. After 20 minutes, I saw it. The land. My father's land. Golden fields stretching toward the horizon, wind brushing through tall grass like it was breathing for me. I parked by the old gate and stepped out. The air was cleaner there, wide and honest. I could still remember him standing by that same fence, his hands in his pockets, telling me that everything worth having takes time. The house that once stood there was gone. Nothing left but its foundation and a few stubborn rose bushes still clinging to life. I knelt beside them and brushed away the dirt. The roots were deep, just like mine. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled without shaking. Maybe this was what it meant to start over, not forgetting what was taken, but remembering what was still yours. When I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the car window. Older, yes, but not broken. There was something new in my face, something I hadn't seen in years. It was peace, fragile but real. And as I started the car, I whispered to the empty road, "Next time they talk about me, let them say I came back to life." I drove back to the land the next morning with a thermos of coffee and a notebook I hadn't written in for years. The road was quiet, a thin grey ribbon between fields that glowed gold in the early light. When I parked by the fence again, the wind was waiting for me, gentle, familiar, almost like an old friend clearing its throat before saying, "You're home." The grass was tall, dotted with wild flowers that hadn't needed anyone's permission to grow. I walked slowly, tracing the edge of the old property line. My father had once marked it with wooden posts and rusted wire, now half buried in the soil. I remembered how he'd made me help him drive the posts into the ground, telling me that a boundary wasn't just for keeping people out. It was for reminding yourself where you begin. I stopped near the oak tree that used to shade the house. Its branches were wider now, and the swing he built for me still hung from one of them, the rope frayed but strong. I sat down beneath it, opened my notebook, and wrote the date. Then I wrote 3 words: I still belong. For a while, I just watched the land breathe. The sound of the wind moving through the grass was steady, almost human. It reminded me of the rhythm of someone asleep, someone safe. I hadn't felt that kind of peace since before Thomas started changing. Before the silences, the excuses, the way he stopped saying my name like it meant something. I walked farther until I reached the small creek that bordered the north side. The water was low but clear. I crouched and dipped my fingers in, letting the cold bite remind me that I was still alive. I whispered, "You were right, Daddy. The land remembers." When I stood again, something inside me shifted. Not suddenly but quietly, like a door finally unlocking after years of waiting. I knew in that moment that this land wasn't just a memory or a hiding place. It was a beginning. As I turned back towards the car, I noticed the old mailbox by the gate. It hadn't been used in decades, but there was an envelope sticking out, probably something left behind long ago. I pulled it free. The paper was stiff and yellowed, addressed in my name. Inside was a notice from a local development company, dated months earlier. They wanted to buy the property for a sum large enough to make my breath catch. I stared at the numbers, then laughed softly to myself. Thomas had taken everything he could reach, and still, he'd left me standing on gold. The wind picked up, brushing against my hair like an answer. I folded the letter and looked out across the land one more time. The sun was higher now, bright and unflinching. Maybe this was what real power felt like. Not revenge, not wealth, but the quiet knowing that you were never as small as someone tried to make you. I closed my notebook and whispered to the horizon, "This time, the land won't forget me either." I saw her before she saw me. The grocery store parking lot was half empty that morning, a small mercy. I had only stopped for flour and coffee, but fate seems to love ordinary places. She stepped out of a silver car that didn't belong in our town, wearing sunglasses too large for her face and a perfume that arrived 3 seconds before she did. Elena. She looked exactly how I imagined the kind of woman Thomas would leave me for. Polished, practiced, young enough to make him feel alive again. She wore her beauty like armor, and every movement said, "I won." I could have turned around. I should have. But after years of pretending not to see what was right in front of me, I stayed. She noticed me at the produce aisle, between the apples and the lemons. Her smile was quick and bright, the kind that hides poison behind politeness. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with something between sympathy and pride, "if it isn't Margaret." I held her gaze, steady. "Eleanor, I hope there are no hard feelings," she continued, picking up an apple she had no intention of buying. "Thomas told me you were strong. I'm glad to see he wasn't lying." I almost laughed. Strong. That was the word people used when they wanted to avoid saying broken. I placed my basket on the counter. "Hard feelings," I said, my tone light, almost casual. "No. He made his choices. I made mine." For a moment she faltered. Just a flicker, but enough. Maybe she expected tears or bitterness. Instead, I smiled. The kind of smile that comes from knowing something the other person doesn't. When I reached the checkout, I heard her behind me. Her voice was low, tight with annoyance. "Do you take American Express?" she asked. The cashier apologized. The machine beeped twice, then once more. Declined. The silence that followed was delicious. She fumbled for another card, a different tone now, nervous, embarrassed. The cashier's polite smile said everything. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I paid for my things and walked out into the morning air, the sun warm on my face. As I reached my car, I saw her through the window. Shoulders stiff, smile gone. For the first time since Thomas left, I didn't feel small. I felt unshakable. I drove home with the windows down, the wind in my hair, and the faintest trace of satisfaction resting in my chest. I didn't need to humiliate her. Life had already started doing that for me. That evening, as I placed my groceries on the counter, I caught my reflection in the window, calm, older, certain. I whispered to it, "Let her keep the pieces he left behind. I've already started building something better." The days began to fall into rhythm again, slow, steady, unhurried. I moved out to the small cottage on my father's land, the one we used to use for harvest seasons. It wasn't much. 2 rooms, a leaky roof, and a porch that leaned slightly toward the sunrise. But it was mine, completely mine. I cleaned it myself, swept out the spiders, painted the walls a soft cream, fixed the hinges on the front door. There was something healing about repairing things with my own hands. For years I'd been the woman who waited for someone else to take care of the broken parts. Now I was the one holding the hammer. The first night I slept there, I lay awake, listening to the wind move through the fields. It sounded like breathing, not heavy or restless, but calm. I realized then that silence didn't have to mean loneliness. Sometimes silence is dignity taking up space. I started planting again. Nothing big, just tomatoes, herbs, a few rows of corn. Grace came by one afternoon and laughed at me for working in my old gardening hat. "You look like your father," she said, handing me lemonade. I smiled. That's the best thing anyone said to me in a long time. Weeks passed and I sold my first small harvest at the farmer's market. The money wasn't much, but the feeling was worth more than every dollar Thomas had ever counted. Each sale was a quiet reminder that I hadn't been destroyed, just replanted. By late autumn, I began receiving letters again, not from my past, but from the world noticing me. A local developer wrote asking if I'd ever considered selling my land. Their offer was high, too high, enough to change everything. I folded the letter carefully and set it on the table without answering. For once, I wanted to sit with the power of choosing. Thomas had made every decision for both of us, always for our future. But this future was mine alone, and I wanted to take my time deciding what it was worth. That evening, as the sky turned the color of old copper, I made tea and sat on the porch. The air was cool, and the fields glowed in the last light of the day. I thought about Thomas, not with anger, not even with sadness, just a detached curiosity. He had always needed noise. Parties, deals, arguments, distractions. I wondered if he'd ever sit in silence like this without reaching for a drink or a reason to talk. Probably not. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of soil and lemon balm. For the first time, I realized that revenge didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was as simple as peace. And when the first star appeared, I whispered into the dusk, I hope wherever you are, you hear this quiet and understand what it means. You lost more than money, Thomas. You lost me. It was late October when he came back. The air carried that sharp, dry chill that smells like the start of winter. I was on the porch, folding laundry and listening to the wind move through the bare trees when I saw a familiar figure coming up the dirt road. For a moment I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw the limp in his step, the hunched shoulders, the same leather jacket I'd given him 20 years ago, cracked and faded now, like everything else he'd held on to too long. Thomas. He stopped at the gate, hesitating as if the land itself might turn him away. I didn't move. I just watched. The silence between us stretched across the yard, heavy but not uncomfortable, at least not for me. Margaret, he said finally. His voice was smaller than I remembered. You look... well. I didn't answer. I waited, letting him feel every inch of the distance he'd built. I've had a rough time, he continued, eyes darting to the ground. Things didn't work out the way I thought. Elena, she's gone, took what was left. I folded the towel in my hands and placed it neatly on the chair beside me. I'm not surprised, I said quietly. He nodded, swallowing hard. I made mistakes. I almost laughed. Mistakes. That was his word for betrayal, for the years he stole from me, for the life he left in pieces. But I didn't say that. I didn't need to. He shifted his weight and looked around. You've done well for yourself, he said, trying to smile. This place looks nice. It was my father's, I replied. You remember him, don't you? The man who warned me about people who mistake greed for love. His face tightened. Margaret, please. I didn't come to argue. I came because I need help. I stood slowly smoothing my skirt. Help, I repeated, tasting the word. You mean money? He didn't deny it. Just until I get back on my feet, I lost everything. I looked past him, toward the fading sun. So did I said softly. Difference is, I learned to live without it. He took a step closer. Please, I'm not asking for much. I met his eyes then, really looked at him. The man who once promised me the world and left me with debts and silence. His hair was thinner, his hands rougher. He looked small. Come in, I said finally. His head jerked up in surprise. Inside, the cottage smelled of tea and earth. I poured 2 cups and handed him one. You should eat something, I said. He nodded, grateful, taking a shaky sip. I sat across from him, calm, steady. For the first time in our marriage, and in its aftermath, I realized I wasn't the one begging anymore. He had come to my door empty-handed, and I was the one who got to decide what happened next. I let the silence grow between us, rich and deliberate. It didn't hurt this time. It spoke for me. When he finally looked up, I smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly, but truthfully. Funny, I said. You once told me I'd be nothing without you, and here you are, asking me for everything. His eyes dropped. I stood, walked to the window, and watched the last light fade over my land. The wind outside whispered against the glass, like it was reminding me of something I already knew. Dignity doesn't shout, it waits. And tonight, it had been worth the wait. He stayed the night. I didn't invite him to, but I didn't stop him either. It wasn't kindness, it was curiosity. I wanted to see how a man like Thomas handled humility. He slept on the couch, restless, mumbling in his sleep like he was arguing with ghosts. I watched from the hallway for a moment, then turned away. There was nothing left between us except unfinished truths. The next morning he tried to help himself to coffee. I let him. He needed to feel useful, even in my kitchen. "You've done well for yourself," he said again, looking around. "It's peaceful here. You always liked that." "Yes," I answered, "but peace wasn't something you ever offered me." He tried to smile, but it broke before it reached his eyes. "I was stupid, Margaret. I didn't see what I had." "You saw," I said softly. "You just didn't care." For a while neither of us spoke. The air was thick with all the things we never said during 40 years of marriage. Then he cleared his throat and looked toward the window. "I don't know where to go," he admitted. "I have nothing left. The bank took the house. The company went under. I'm tired." I set my cup down and looked at him. Really looked. The man who once made me feel small now sat at my table like a child lost in a store. "You said the bank took the house?" I asked. He nodded. "Foreclosed. Everything's gone." I walked to the cabinet and pulled out a folder, the one that held my father's deed, the letters, the offer from the developers. I placed it in front of him. "Not everything," I said. He frowned, confused. "What's this?" "Read it." He opened the folder and scanned the first page. His brow furrowed, then his mouth fell open. This is our property deed," he stammered. "But your name's on it. Just yours." "It always was," I said calmly. "That house you thought you built? It was standing on my father's land. The accounts you emptied didn't touch this place. You never could, Thomas. It was never yours to take." He looked up at me, eyes wide, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "You're lying." I shook my head. "No, I just stopped telling you everything, the same way you stopped telling me where you were every night." He leaned back, running a trembling hand through his thinning hair. "All those years," he whispered. "You had money, property, and you just let me think." "That you were in control," I finished. "Yes, because it was easier to let you believe it. Power doesn't need to prove itself, Thomas. It just waits for truth to do the work." He looked small then, smaller than I'd ever seen him. The arrogance, the charm, the man who once filled every room with his voice, gone. Just a shell sitting in a chair he didn't deserve. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have taken it," I replied. "And I wanted something left that was mine, untouched by your hands." He pressed his palms to his face, and for a long moment the only sound was his shallow breathing. Then he whispered, "I'm sorry." I almost felt pity. Almost. "I'm sure you are," I said. "But sorry doesn't rebuild a life. It doesn't unbreak a woman." I stood and walked toward the door. The morning light spilled across the floorboards, catching the edges of the papers between us. "You should go," I said softly, "before you start thinking there's still something here for you." He hesitated, then rose slowly. At the threshold, he turned back. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "Margaret, you won." I shook my head. "No, Thomas. I just stopped losing." He left without another word. I stood by the window, watching him walk down the road, smaller with every step, until the wind took the dust behind him and erased the trail. Underneath my feet, the floor felt solid, like truth itself was holding me up. After he left, the house felt heavier. Not empty, not lonely, just filled with everything unsaid. The silence pressed against me, thick and alive, carrying the echo of his voice, his footsteps, his regret. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but tears would have been too easy. Instead, I cleaned the table where the papers had been, folded the cloth neatly, and put the kettle on. I needed the ordinary to remind me that life goes on, even after the final goodbye you never thought you'd get. When the tea was ready, I sat by the window and watched the wind ripple through the tall grass. It moved gently, without hesitation. The land didn't care about our mistakes. It just kept breathing. I envied that. Later that afternoon, Grace came by. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at me the way only old friends can, straight through the skin, into the truth. "He came back, didn't he?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "And?" "I told him the truth," I said. "All of it." Grace smiled, slow and proud. "Good. It's about time he learned what a real woman looks like when she's free." We sat in silence for a while, sipping tea that had gone lukewarm. Then she asked, "Do you feel better?" I thought about that. "No," I said finally, "not better, just lighter." That night I took out a box I hadn't opened since the day he left, the one with our wedding album, yellowed letters, and the last birthday card he ever gave me. The handwriting looked like a stranger's. I touched the corner of the photo where we were young, smiling, believing in forever. He used to say I was too sentimental, that I held on to things that didn't matter. Maybe he was right. So I took a deep breath, tore the card in half, then the photograph, then another, until what was left fit into the palm of my hand. I carried the pieces outside to the fire pit behind the house. The night was still. I lit a match and dropped it in. The paper curled and blackened, then turned to ash. I didn't look away. When it was done, I whispered, "I forgive you." The words surprised me, but they came out soft and true. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a gift for him. It was my final act of freedom. The stars above the fields were sharp and cold. I tilted my head back and breathed in the night. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't angry or sad or even proud. I was simply whole. Inside, I sat by the fire, wrapping myself in an old blanket. On the mantel was the photograph of my grandson, Lucas, his smile wide and full of everything still possible. I smiled back at him. Thomas was gone. The past was quiet. The land was mine, and so was I. Spring came early that year. The frost melted from the fields before the trees were ready, and the earth woke up hungry for light. I spent my mornings on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the mist lift off the land like an exhale. Every day looked a little softer, a little more forgiving. Lucas came to visit for the weekend. He ran through the fields barefoot, chasing the wind, his laughter stretching across the acres my father once plowed by hand. I watched him from the porch and thought about all the lives this land had carried, my father's, mine, and now his. When he grew tired, he came running back to me, cheeks flushed and eyes bright. "Grandma, this place feels alive," he said. I smiled, brushing a curl off his forehead. "It is. It's been waiting for us." He curled up beside me, his head against my shoulder, and I realized how small the world can feel when someone loves you without condition. For years, I'd lived next to a man who made me believe love had to be earned. But love, the real kind, doesn't ask you to shrink. It lets you take up space. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, I cooked dinner with Lucas, mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables, and the same lemon pie my father used to make. We laughed when the crust fell apart, and for the first time in a long time, the sound of laughter in this house didn't hurt. After he went to bed, I stepped outside again. The air was cool, scented with grass and the faint trace of smoke from a distant chimney. Fireflies blinked near the fence line, soft as breathing. I thought of Thomas, not with anger anymore, but with a strange, quiet gratitude. He had left me with nothing, and in doing so, he'd given me everything that mattered back. My freedom, my voice, my name. I walked down to the edge of the field, where the soil was rich and dark. I knelt, pressed my hand to the ground, and whispered, "Thank you, Daddy, for reminding me where I belong." The stars were coming out, one by one. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, lonely but proud. As I turned back toward the cottage, I caught my reflection in the window. Gray hair, soft lines, eyes steady and clear. I didn't see the woman he left behind anymore. I saw the woman who stayed, who endured, who bloomed again. I sat down at the kitchen table, opened my notebook, and wrote. He left with nothing. I stayed with everything that matters. Then I closed the notebook, blew out the candle, and smiled. Because sometimes victory doesn't come with applause. It comes with peace. Have you ever rebuilt yourself after someone tried to erase you? Share your story in the comments. Someone out there might need to hear it.